Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, there is quite a bit to cover. Of course, there is the Putin interview that we will get into in a couple minutes here. We do have some brief updates on the battlefield in Ukraine first. Not to mention, we're going to touch on some stuff with Biden, and if we have time to get around to it, some Middle Eastern news. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to you to tell us what's been happening on the front line, especially with the developments in Avdiivka.
Okay. Yeah, that is where most of the fighting is happening. There is some updates from Sinkovka in the Kupiansk direction and Novomihailovka. And I'll mention some things about those battles and how grueling they have been. But I suppose the centerpiece is Avdiivka. I'm going to send you an image, and this image is roughly from February the 2nd or the 3rd. Today is the 10th that we're recording. And we are airing it today, right?
Correct.
Yes. So this is current. So this is about a week to 8 days back. Let me just get this February the 4th. February the 4th. But this gives you an idea of where Avdiivka was about a week ago. And then I'm gonna just switch over to the Telegram account and go to your. So um, now, if you followed that with the first image I sent you, there was a collapse that happened, and it basically happened the next day or two. And you can see that territory, the Russians gained a massive amount of territory just over this water reservoir. It's a man-made lake. I think it was like this is close to another industrial zone. There is a heap um, on the east side, right side, looking at it of this water reservoir. Um, then the second image will show you the advancements that followed the next day. That's slide number 2. And further advancements that happened, slide number 3. And you can ignore the last 2 slides because of, essentially I've already discussed them. So what you're seeing is some very interesting gains by the Russians in Avdiivka. They've managed to um, secure that area of the railroad tracks north of Avdiivka. So nothing can get in from there. And interestingly, now I have an image of what is probably now the only road that can help the Ukrainians with transportation. I'll send this to you now. Sorry, pressed the wrong button. So you can see that right now there is basically going to be only one road leading in and out of Devka. It's the only paved road that they have, and it's coinciding basically with the end of winter. Today is over. It's plus. It's in the pluses. So most of everything is melting. Of course, that's not true in northern Ukraine, like Kiev, Sumy, Kupiansk, Kharkov. All those areas are still have snowfall from the last, say, 24 to 48 hours, from what I can see. Um, and the Russians have made they have made these gains, and now there's an encirclement that's happening to the point where the city itself could be divided in two. And I have some images um, of the spearhead where this could happen. So this is an image from Weeb Union. The 2 red dots indicate what was taken today or yesterday. And the gray outlines that you see are the areas that were taken since, like, let's say February the 4th or February the 3rd at the earliest, right? Um, I did see that on South Front, the claim that that lake reservoir around which the Russians have had to navigate with their forces um, was has again, it has a dump. It's much smaller than the waste heap across the motor plant or the industrial zone to the north of Avdiivka. But apparently, it was from there that they used their cannons to fire on Donetsk City. Now, I don't think that's the only place they're firing on Donetsk City. And as long as we're talking about that, we should mention that, on December 30th, 24 or 25 people were killed uh, by Ukrainians shelling um, uh, people in Belgorod. And then a week later, 28 people were killed in Donetsk City. And then a few days after that, in between these episodes that we're bringing you guys, another 28 people were killed in Lysychansk, in that area of Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, kind of like north of Donetsk and west of Lugansk. So, you know, and it's funny when you see like a BBC report that says 7 people died, including 3 children, because the Russians retaliated by hitting an oil depot or some kind of gas depot. There's confusion on the BBC whether this was like a gas station or a depot where like a kind of a refinery or a place where these things are held. Now, a day or two earlier, an oil depot was hit by the Ukrainians in Rostov-on-Don. Before that, that I forgot to mention on the last show, there was another one that was hit in a city that is north of Belgorod but south of Moscow. I don't know how close it would be to, say, Voronezh, but it would be around that area, relatively speaking. Um, so, I mean, it's very unfortunate that that it's come to this, and I don't know what to say. But there are civilian casualties, and it's very regrettable. But okay, so moving on now. There's some interesting things that have happened. We'll get to the Ukrainian high command, but there's
Yes.
interesting things that have happened in the Russian command. And that has to deal with 2 fronts. One is the front at Kupiansk, and I'll send you a map right now. So this is, of course, you can't see Kupiansk on the map because there's a blow up. Sinkovka is the village next to Kupiansk. If you see where Sinkovka is, right there, in the sort of bottomish center of the screen.
You can see it labeled on the map with the bastardized Ukrainian spelling.
Yeah, but if you go towards the bottom left-hand corner, that's where Kupiansk is. So there was an interesting rotation of officers. I did one of the shows that we did, I believe, back in December, which showed no less than 3 disastrous attempts to secure Sinkovka. And it showed the Russians, first of all, their army units like reduced by 60% at least, and also just dropping off men to essentially die in the outskirts of this village without securing the forest. And the officer in charge of this was let go, and he has been replaced. And the result of it is now that the Russians do have a foothold in Sinkovka, and the reason for it is, as you can see, they've secured the forest area right next to it. Right before, they were driving in an open terrain on this windy road that led from the north, leading into Sinkovka. Like, I mean, I'm sorry, but like a lot of the Russian military officer staff is garbage. It's not that great. And thank God, like I don't, I don't know how they could be so bad at this. And of course, the other area where there's been a lot of fighting, including it was either this past week or the week before. The Russians did secure this area. Now we're moving to Novomihailovka, which is south of Deivka and slightly west of Donetsk City. Um, the Russians have had very heavy fighting. As I said, there was a column and a video that no, it's only part of the video because 10 of the 12 armored vehicles were destroyed or disabled, but they managed to dump off the men. And the men formed a bridgehead. They eventually captured a part of it. And this is from the 9th. The latest maps I've seen is that they've actually gained more ground in the eastern part of Novomihailovka. Uh, I don't know if this has been changed, but one of the things that they're doing that they didn't do before is reinforcement. After you take something, you reinforce, you reinforce, you reinforce. And we've said it on the other shows that the Russians have not been doing that. And it's been costly and time wasting, frankly, right? Um, so maybe I'll give you a blow up of kind of where the situation is right now. This is a map from, I believe, the 9th. Um, Getting back to Avdiivka, you can see now that the Russians are only a few hundred meters away from the main road. And if they manage to reach this road, right, that is what will divide the city into two. And I think after that, it's going to be extremely hard for the Ukrainians to dislodge them. And I suppose this is a good time and a good segue to get into the whole hullabaloo with um, Zaluzhnyi, Syrskyi, and Zelensky.
The
Uh,
Banderites have lost, unfortunately.
yes, they have. I mean, and you kind of knew that because Victoria Nuland had to fly to Ukraine to resolve this feud. You know, like what's her name? The other Jewish woman who
That doesn't
point
narrow it down.
yeah who point blank tells you that Dana Roll or Stroll
Yeah,
or
yeah,
Strobel.
that's it's something like
What's her
that.
name? It's Dana something, Dana. Anyways, we own a third of Syria. Oh, just like that, huh? You're actually living in my house. My ancestors lived here 3,000 years ago.
Oi,
So
Gewalt.
so um so anyways, um Syrskyi is now the head general for the entire Ukrainian military. He was the general for the entire army, which placed him beneath um, Zaluzhny. The struggle between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, particularly with reference to his firing, because of course the struggle has lasted almost a year that we know of.
Should I pull
But
up the
the
list of insults that that
oh yeah,
here?
go
What
ahead.
I it's keep talking. I need to find it.
Yeah. Okay, so the firing of Zaluzhny, I think, took something like 8 days. Like it took about a week. And apparently he was offered a job as a diplomat, an emissary of some kind for any Western nation of his choosing. A lot of this stuff honestly can't be verified, even though like they had Rada politicians that I saw on Ukrainian talk shows being interviewed. One of them clearly stated that. I mean, who knows? Maybe it's not outside the realm of impossibility. It's not outside the realm of possibility. But Zaluzhny is gone, and much of the strife between him and Zelensky is personal, but I also think much of it has to deal with strategy.
Well, was it him or Reznikov that got caught on the Cyprus vacation?
I think it was Resnikov.
Yeah, and that was like right before they fired him, right? It's a
Yeah, and
couple
he got a
months.
sweet position. the Ukrainian embassy in Britain.
Oh yeah, because once again, with somebody like Zaluzhnyi, you cannot afford to leave this man completely spurned because till he will turn on you, and we may still see that. So, what happens with him? But I do have the list of insults whenever you're ready, and
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
I quote: "The gay comedian, low grade comedian, disparaging term for a Jewish individual. I'll just say for the sake of YouTube. Stuart Little,
I
Krivi
love Stuart
Roig,
Little.
imbecile, Brett, Sniffer, The Bluff, Frodo, Poltorashka, Mozadik, and FIFA."
I have no idea what the I have no idea what the FIFA stuff means, but it's hilarious.
Yeah, they're all great. I'd say Krivirog Imbecile probably has to be my favorite out of all of those. But with those leaked insults aside, once again, Zaluzhnyi, despite the fact that he is far more, I suppose for lack of a better term, radical on the issue of Ukrainian nationalism and Ukraine as a state, he's also at the same time much more pragmatic than Zelensky, and certainly much more pragmatic than Syrski is.
Mhm.
And that he was willing to eat the cost of perhaps a tactical retreat, willing to dig in for a further defense and fight this war in a more, say, conservative sense. But he is gone, I think, particularly because of that, beyond just the clash of personalities, which was certainly there. But we're talking about the top two most popular figures in the country, that being Zelensky and Zaluzhnyi, and he completely spurned the other one. Reznikov, when he was fired, that was complete afterthought. Nobody thought about Reznikov. Nobody thought about the Minister of Defense. And like you said, that he got his golden parachute. They put him up in a very nice position. They're trying to find Zaluzhny's golden parachute, which I have to imagine is going to have to be a lot more substantial than a simple position as ambassador or anything beyond those lines, unless he just disappears, which I'm not putting it past the capability of the SBU to make that happen. Now, whether that be a politically wise move because everyone would know what happens, it, once again, there's things to consider. But is Zelensky desperate enough or short-sighted enough to do something like that? I think that remains to be seen. I personally don't think so. I think they're just going to try to find somewhere they can put him on the shelf, somewhere they can send him that he won't cause trouble. I don't know. Maybe he'll be some sort of attaché to the Pentagon in order to direct this war effort from Washington, where he'll still be part of it, but a lot more distant. Maybe he'll be in charge of training Ukrainian forces that are in Western Europe with the training programs they've had in Britain, Germany, etc. Like I said, there's many possibilities, but I do believe that if something substantial is not done with Zaluzhny in one direction or the other, whether that be the golden parachute or whether they just eliminate him, arrest him, whatever that might be, he is going to present a latent threat. And the question is, when we get to Zaluzhny, because he's not an irrational man, he's not a stupid man. And I would
The
say,
Russians respect them.
yes, absolutely. And I would say, not to exaggerate, Zelensky has moments of impulsiveness and stupidity on many occasions, especially considering the fact, being somebody like him, with his level of political experience before this war, he is somebody way out of his depth, which leads to far stupider decisions on his part. And the question is Zaluzhny, for the sake of the war effort, going to decide it's better that he accept his sidelining or think that something needs to be done about Zelensky? Because despite what you might think of him as a man, what you might think of him as a figure, what you might think of what he's done, I don't believe that this man is a genuine Ukrainian nationalist in his truest beliefs. I do think that I don't think it's any sort of cynical ploy. I don't think it's anything like that. I think this man buys 100% into the Ukrainian nationalist narrative and genuinely does believe in it. And the question is he willing to, because of that, accept his own sidelining if it means the sake of the war and the sake of the country? Or conversely, is it going to lead that I am the only person who can put this back on track, especially compared to this clown who is currently in charge right now? And that's the question that remains to be seen. I don't know how that's going to play out. But I actually, and maybe I'm giving him too much credit, err towards the side of the fact that he's going to think of the national interest first and realize that any move by him would just be a destabilizing act.
I completely agree. I think he knows. Like, just to backtrack a little bit on the like Zaluzhnyi, whether he liked it or not, you know, he understood that for them to win this war would require like close to 500,000 more men, right? Uh, but the other thing about Zaluzhny is when he saw the tactics weren't working in the Zaporozhye front, particularly Rabotina, he pulled back and he went to strengthen other parts of the front line, right? Uh, yeah, you could argue so and say, well, that was kind of foolish. What was the whole point of trying to retake Bakhmut? That was stupid. Perhaps, perhaps, but they're also afraid of like a major Russian breakthrough as well, and they have to stymie that in some way. Now, it could be that maybe even though Syrskyi is stationed mostly in the Kupiansk area, remember he's the one who sounded all the alarm bells back in August when the Russians made gains there. Um, it could be that Syrskyi was more involved with that. I know that the defense of Bakhmut was Syrskyi. The defense, also, the defense of Kiev was his. But we know now from the interview, there's some. I mean, people still hold on to this idea that there was a great Ukrainian front and the Russians left Kiev when that was. We all know that was part of a peace agreement, right? That was a goodwill gesture, and as soon as they left, the deal was scrapped because that is what they needed. And that is partly why they lost the South to the Russians, is because they were so preoccupied not losing Kiev that they didn't have enough forces to stop the incursions and the successful taking of territory by the Russians, including like Melitopol and Mariupol, right? And even Kherson City, which the Russians gave up later that year. But the Russians essentially have a land bridge and they completely control the Azov Sea now. Um, so I the record isn't that great, but I think he was also the commander for the Kharkov offensive, which wasn't quite like the Kherson offensive where the Russians pulled out. They realized that it was basically only some uh, pontoons and one bridge that got shelled regularly, and that if the Ukrainians decided to destroy the dam, which they eventually did just a few weeks later, then that would be it. You'd have these guys trapped, and so they left. But the Kharkov, like I'm just saying that Syrskyi has had a spotty record. He was also the guy that was there in the start of the war, the start of the hostilities back in 2014 and 15. It was he who got his troops surrounded in Debaltsevo, and the whole point of Debaltsevo was to take it and split basically Donetsk city from Lugansk city down the middle. And actually, what happened after losing there is that now the Russians didn't have to go like in these weird big U-shaped patterns to avoid the Baltsevo, which is halfway between, or I'm saying roughly halfway between Lugansk and Donetsk, right? Um, so he's had a spotty record. He's the one who, but the most important thing is he's the one who has always listened to um, Zelensky, right? And he has a very bad reputation. The the Ukrainian troops used an old Soviet nomenclature. Uh, General 200, 200 is code for dead, 300 is code for wounded. What's the other one? There's another derogatory name that they use for him for using meat grinder tactics, right?
I mean, there's the obvious butcher one, but
Yeah, yes, that's right, General Butcher. General Butcher. Yeah, that's the other one. So him and Zelensky, they kind of agree on the same methodology. Uh, Zaluzhnyi is a far more intelligent man. He's much more willing um, to go his own way and not follow what Washington wants him to do, right? Because it would be disastrous. I don't agree with one take I saw that this was all an elaborate scheme for Zaluzhnyi to, leave his post. I just think that's so it's so
And
conspiratorial.
I do think when you actually get to the question of Zaluzhnyi, it really does show the difference of the way that Ukrainians view themselves and the way that their sponsors view them. Because, like I said, you can think whatever you want about Ukraine. Certainly, I don't have a positive opinion in the slightest, as anyone who's listened to this program has probably gathered by this point. But like I said, you can realize that this is a man who is truly a patriot, truly a nationalist, truly cares about at least his
Yeah,
conception of the Ukrainian nation.
yeah,
You go to Washington, you go to Brussels, you go to Paris, Berlin. This is a meat grinder. We can't really see a difference between these people, but if they want to fight, if they want to destroy each other, then that's fine by us. We'll support it. And that has been the fundamental split between at least the Ukrainian military under Zaluzhny and the foreign sponsors. And once again, Syrski is a yes man for that. But I do want to point out something about Syrski. So,
yes, that's right.
does
That's right.
anyone? I'll give the audience a few minutes to guess. Does anyone like to take a guess of where Syrski was born and raised? Okay, I'll give you another 5 seconds here.
Florida.
If only. If now, for those of you who said Russia or Moscow or the Moscow area, you would be correct. And not only that, but Zelensky is Jewish, as Putin did tell us, and we'll get into the interview. And the current defense minister of Ukraine, Yumeryov, is both Tatar and Jewish, which means without firing a single shot, at least in that regard, Ukraine is now under the control of the Judeo-Moscow Tatar horde. By their own hand.
But
By their own hand.
nobody forced them.
Completely free choice, but uh, once again, getting back to the actual topic at hand here, I don't think that anything that has happened in this war since, even going all the way back to 2014, has really shown, at least from the collective West perspective, how expendable the Ukrainians are than this move right here, than somebody like Syrski,
Hmm.
than something like Bakhmut. And you listen to what the politicians, what the media says, and this is beyond even just individual shows you might run into on Twitter or YouTube or wherever. When you have Nikki Haley or these other Republican candidates or these Democratic politicians or these figures in the media on CNN, Fox, wherever, saying, well, not a single American life has been lost, and look at how many casualties we've inflicted on Russia. Once again, that's at the cost of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives in any given scenario. And like I said, despite the fact that they may harangue, they may get up on their high horse and shout about this, fundamentally, as far as these people are concerned, there are no difference between Ukrainians and Russians, even the Western Ukrainians. They're
Yeah.
all just backwards Easterners. They're all just people who live in the forests and the swamps. They couldn't care less about them, but they'll puff up the ego of Ukrainians and their national project once again if it means getting one over on Russia and killing some Russian troops. And like I said, this isn't me speculating. This is their outright statements about the topic.
Right, and we shouldn't forget that, like any Ukrainian nationalist, right? Like, it's kind of like Britain. Like, you're only as relevant as Russia is strong. The same thing applies to Poland. So, um, let's say the war continues. Well, then, because there was that photo that Zaluzhny posted with a portrait of Bandera, and the guy he was posting it with had a flag that in Ukrainian it's written um, "Victory with something without negotiations," right? Um, so what happens to guys like Zaluzhnyi if Ukraine is victorious? Well, that depends on how strong Russia is afterwards, right? Um, Generally, if Ukraine wins, then they're not going to need them as much as they need them. That's why before February 2022, once in a while you'd see a scathing article about Ukrainian neo-Nazis,
Oh
and they
yes,
would
from
they would
2018,
always
2019, that
compartmentalize.
was
Sorry.
you actually going back to touch on your point there. In 2018, 2019, the lead up to actually Zelensky's election, you saw a number of these pieces, and you could tell
Yes.
that they at that point they thought the Ukrainian conflict had frozen over. The Donbass
Mm,
republics were
mm,
going to remain in this semi-independent state. Russia's annexed Crimea. We'll never recognize it, but in our conduct and our policy, we're going to recognize it, just not in an official sense.
mm-hmm.
So we're going to put this clown in power so we can pillage Ukraine to the fullest extent. Look, we already got the land to the IMF. We already got a lot of what we want from Poroshenko and the Maidan, but let's just finish the job with somebody like Zelensky. Then all of a sudden, the war drums start beating in Ukraine again. Tensions escalate around 2021, 2022. They come to a head, and they're put in this position where they have to rehabilitate these Ukrainian nationalists after what looks like they were trying to put them on the shelf. They were trying to put them away because they more or less conceded that Ukraine was a lost cause. But lo and behold, it happens. Now, I have to say, given the direction of that, probably once Biden got in power, once that wing of the elite got in power, they realized this was a viable project once again. So they were
Mm-hmm.
able to put that. But you're right that they were trying to dismantle this. They were trying to throw these people under the bus.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
do speculate that in the event of what's most likely going to be at least somewhat of a Russian victory at this point, the best case scenario for a lot of these people is they end up becoming contractors with groups like Blackwater, or at the worst case is they are completely thrown under the bus and tried by the ICC, and maybe they'll be cellmates with Putin.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason that certain Nazis and Nazi collaborators were integrated into, um, let's say, the NATO system, the U.S. system, right? Some of them became hosts on what was it, Freedom Radio, America. There were
Radio
two of
Free
them.
Europe
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Radio Liberty.
yeah. Some of them became heads of NATO, like the German guy who was head of NATO after World War II. Of his, I forget his name. He was an engineer, and anyhow, uh, um, no, I'm confusing him with Baerbock's grandfather. No, he was a general. Anyhow, um, I don't know why some of them were hung and others were promoted, but that's what happened. And
I mean, they need to make an example. And once again, before anyone starts casting any aspersions, yes, we realize that the Russians also did integrate their captured German and Nazi
they
prisoners
did,
into their
yes,
system.
yeah,
Which, I will actually defend in both cases. It's the spoils of war. When you win a war, you get access to your enemy's resources. It's just as simple.
yeah. It is what it is. It's just that I think a lot of people, particularly like I think Europeans are more aware of it, but I don't think like Canadians and Americans are. Anyhow, all to say that there is always the potential that like hardcore Ukrainian nationalism, which can almost is impossible to divorce from like neo-Nazism. It can never be completely divorced, and so that always has to be modified. It has to be tapped down upon
Well, I think something
whenever.
else to point out with that is that any sort of elements sympathetic to Russia in Galicia were quite literally genocided in the 1910s during World War One. That
Yeah,
the Austrians took anyone, any Orthodox, anyone who showed sympathy to Russia, even Catholics, and they stuck them in camps and either
yeah,
re-educated them or executed them. And
yeah,
so, I mean, at that point, while that, and we'll get into this when we get into Putin's speech. While the history of that region has been complex, especially with Galicia, that western part of Ukraine, on its identity, that sealed the deal. The fact that this area will likely never be Russian again, at least for for centuries, if ever.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And but I will say this: you remember back, I think it was in November or December. I brought up a friend I know. She's of um, Hispanic and Italian descent, but
Yes,
mostly
yes.
Hispanic. And she had a boyfriend once who was either black or black mix, and he was in the Canadian military, and he talked about like the Nazism there and so on and so on, and he was like okay with it, and she was outraged. She goes, "How could you possibly?" And what I find interesting though, and she brought it up again, and I said, "But isn't it interesting how they've managed over time to reconcile, um, let's say, Jews with this ideology, because now that ideology simply means anti-Russian." I go, you have to admit it was their persistence is kind of paying off. I mean, people have to do some mental gymnastics because there are obviously historical contradictions. But I mean, essentially, that's I guess it is like Gladio C instead of Gladio B, right? Like it just it's just a revamped Gladio, but you know, um, I think this is the most ambitious, right? Because you have some Ukrainians going to fight on behalf of Israel. Now, I don't know how mixed they are. I don't know if they have dual citizenship and so on. But in any case,
I mean,
I
mind
just thought
you,
that
on
was
on
I
the
thought
other
that was
end,
interesting.
that
That
Israel was supplying Azov before the war broke out in
yeah,
2014, 2015. And then it is, you're right, there are some hurdles that have to be overcome, but they have come to the conclusion that Nazism is acceptable so long as your anti Semitism is rhetorical and not action based. And that's what we've
right.
seen from Azov. Sure, they
Yeah,
talk about the Judeo Moscow Tatar hordes, which coincidentally their own country is ruled by.
yeah.
And at the end of the day, their entire actions is just. And it even goes down to the petty level of persecuting Ukrainians who aren't Ukrainian enough. Not even Russians. That Ukrainians, people who support the Kiev regime, people who want Ukraine to remain independent. If you so much as speak Russian or speak too much of a Russified Ukrainian, that's unacceptable. But then we'll bring out the Azov rabbi to bless you before battle. That actually happened. Now, it may have been a one-off case. I'm pretty sure it was a one-off case, but once again, that actually did happen. They did have the Azov rabbi, and like I said, this is what we're working with here. These are the contradictions that they have to overcome, and I can only repeat this in so many ways. You are allowed to be a Nazi. You're allowed to adopt the National Socialist trappings, so long as it's over a petty ethnic grievance and not anything substantial.
Yeah. Well, I've read one article. I believe it was the New Yorker. People in the chat can correct me about Ukraine, how Ukraine is still united, and the reporter goes into this room, this small room, and huddled in the room, he says, "There's an overt anti-Semite, a Jew,
Oh,
a
the New Yorker
Tartar."
article.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was
Basically, all the people's groups that hate Russians.
an anti-Semite, a Jew, an Azeri. Like,
Azeri, that's it.
yeah, that's what it was. Hey, hey. Speaking of Turco-Mongol hordes, they, they
Mhm.
they just can't help themselves, can they?
Yeah.
Chechens? You mean those same people who've been working with Ukrainian nationalists since the 1990s? It's everything. Look, say what you will about Russia. Maybe these are problems with Russia. We could get into that at a later point. But everything you say about Russia is equally true, if not more true, about Ukraine. I just want everyone to keep that in mind.
Yeah, yeah.
Everything you can say about
It's
Russia,
always who
it's
whom people
yeah,
use.
it's
People use universalist arguments for ultimately parochial reasons. So
I will admit, and I'm going to take a completely unbiased position here. While I may have personal objections to some things that happen, especially with the ethnic politics and maybe with the way that maybe Russia is a little too soft on the Muslims for what a traditionally Christian state should be, whatever. But I will admit, and this is for both sides, Russia and Ukraine, this is simply imperial politics. This is just simply the way things work, and we're not going to escape this. And like I said,
yeah,
maybe post-war, maybe at some point in the future, there will be something to rectify at least some of the problems, but a lot of these things are just endemic unless you want to commit to a radical solution, which I frankly think would be a worst
Oh,
case scenario.
that would be a disaster.
Absolutely, and not only from a pragmatic but a moral level, but pretty much all around. But like I said, I don't necessarily like. I'm not getting on my high horse like, oh, Ukraine has Azeris fighting for it, but I just think it's funny given the rhetoric.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course.
But unless you have any more particular news on Ukraine, I suppose we can get into the main topic of the show.
The only thing I'll say further about Ukraine is so Siersky's family up until like 2019, 2020, we're still posting like patriotic stuff about Russia, his parents. And his brother Alexander spoke out and actually said that they haven't been in communication with him for a few years now. So he moved there, by the way, after the Soviet Union fell, and you know, and that's how he eventually rose the ranks and became general there.
Yeah, and I think not that I think anyone had this, but any suspicion of pro-Russian sympathies within the Ukrainian officer class, even people like that, is non-existent because those people were purged after 2014. I'm sure there were uh, many people across the rank and file into the officers of Siersky's background that were purged from their military positions or government positions because they weren't willing to toe the line on Ukraine. And that's because he's certainly not the only one, even a man of prominence, to move from Russia to Ukraine post collapse of the Soviet Union. There was all kinds of movement in between the two, including Belarus, including all the former Soviet republics. It was a very strange situation, which many of the agreements in the Union were still in effect despite the official dissolution of the Union. It wasn't really until 1994, 1995 when these became properly separate entities across the. It collapse of the Soviet Union is a very strange situation in that regard. But with that aside, we can get into the Putin interview. So Tucker Carlson, as I'm sure you know, went to Russia to the Kremlin to interview Putin. Now, I have to admit, I thought this interview was. Uh, I enjoyed it, I will say. But from the interview itself, I thought it was strange and not very well structured, and maybe from the most raw sense, judging it as an interview, as a back and forth, it wasn't good on those metrics in terms of. I don't think Tucker did a good job, but I still think we got a good product. And I think, at least from Tucker's perspective, he was going in expecting maybe what he did with Orban a few months ago, where Orban got up there, gave a lot of his normal talking points about Hungarian nationalism, Euroscepticism, and a call for peace in the Russian-Ukrainian war, and talking about how there needs to be a new security system in Europe, and of course the praise for Donald Trump. And that was Orban's interview. It was good. I would recommend watching it, but it's not very insightful in terms of people who probably are into this kind of stuff. Now, maybe people who have never touched it would find it more insightful, but once again, it was good for what it was. I think Tucker went in expecting another one of those, but he was met with a very
Let's start with the year 826 in the year of
yeah,
our Lord.
yes, and Putin gave what a lot of people have called an in-depth history, but honestly, having listened to it twice at this point, I would say a very broad brushstrokes history of Russia. Now, when you're talking about that kind of stuff with people like us, as somebody who know a lot about this, it's going
Yeah.
to be inadequate. And I don't think that Putin was trying to give an in-depth history. I think he was trying to give a brief historical summary of the Russian nation, of how Ukraine fits into that, and how it's relevant today. And I do think that he succeeded. I don't think Tucker was expecting that. He was expecting one of these zinger interviews where it's I throw out a question, you answer. Not, oh, I remember an anecdote in my personal life where I went on a road trip and figured out that we had Hungarians in the Soviet Union. Stuff like that. Very fascinating stuff in its own right. And if you do have the patience and the attention span to listen, you can see how it all strings together. And well, once again, I did appreciate the historical diatribes. I did think that was very interesting. What was much more interesting was his talks about his time in office in Russia and his attempts to reconcile with the West, particularly with Bill Clinton and with both Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. But like I said, his historical perspective, it, for those of you who are interested, it's certainly worth the listen in that first half hour. And if you pay enough attention and actually try to follow what he says, even though it is all over the place, admittedly, you can connect threads and how he talks about Ukraine and what the point of Ukraine is. I do want to address a few things about that, but I want to focus on probably what I think was the most important part, which was Putin laying out his attempts to integrate with the West. So he first talked about when he was in office in the year 2000. This was after Yeltsin resigned, Putin was newly elected, and Bill Clinton was on the way out of his second term in 2000. And he said that they had met and that the topic of NATO was brought up. And at first, Bill Clinton says, it's in the cards. We could see it happening. He comes back later after consulting with his advisor and says, "Sorry, no can do." And this is after the extensive conversations between Bush Sr. and Yeltsin throughout the 1990s trying to really integrate Russia into the Western system. And this is after the bad blood with Yugoslavia happened because Russia was unable to really help either diplomatically or militarily with the collapse of Yugoslavia, particularly the case of the Serbs, who are, and as Putin had said, a very near and dear nation to the Russians, a very brotherly nation to the Russians. And even that was all put aside. Even that head was buried, at least on the side of the Russians. And then he continues on. He talks about his meetings with George Bush Jr. The same topic is brought up, the question of an integrated missile defense system, the question of a new European security system is brought up, and Bush entertains the idea. Well, Bush comes back and sorry, no can do, and we're going to actually push forward with NATO expansion. Interestingly enough, he actually did not mention anything about his interactions with either Obama or Trump. Which, I mean, okay, Obama, whatever, who cares? I thought it was interesting that he actually did mention Trump once in the interview. Because you figured he would have, at least in terms of talking about diplomatically. Like I said, if you want to compare this to the Orban interview, Orban said, "Well, I hope Trump wins," and of course he's going to say that. Not that Orban is completely in the sphere of the West. He is much more Western aligned, and Hungarian-American relations are possibly salvageable, at least from his perspective. But like I said, and I do think it's both funny and interesting, especially from both sides of the American political aisle, that Trump did not come up once in this interview, and I'm sure that made a lot of journalists seethe because they already had their pieces typed up about the collusion narrative and about how Russia's still influencing U.S. politics. And I do think actually a lot of the anger and resentment from journalists came from the fact that they had these pieces pre-written, they had everything in line, and then Putin subverted their expectations.
Yeah, people have sort of debated as to how effective this interview was, and I think they're kind of disregarding a lot of things. Like you might argue and say the intention of the interview was to educate primarily the American public, but also the Western and global public about how Putin views this war, right? However, whether Putin was advised not to get into history, that is what happened. And the first half an hour is literally like just filled with the history of the Rus, whether that's the Kievan or the Muscovy type. He just considers all of that as basically the same people uh, that might speak different dialects. In any case, of course, he's going to lose a lot of people by doing that, right? Um, However, I tend to think he understands that it's a different audience, right? Because there's a part where Tucker asks him, about Nord Stream 2, and of course Putin says, "Yeah, you guys did Nord Stream 2," or he says, "You did it," and Tucker laughs and says, "Well, I didn't do it. I was working that day, but thank you." I mean, they know
Yeah,
um, that So, um, I mean, at one point, Putin also says, he mentions that Tucker did want to join the CIA at one point, because his father, I don't know if people know, his father is very well connected. So I think Putin is also he's addressing the higher ups. The elites. The rest of the stuff is window dressing. A lot of it is really for the Russian public and for the Eastern European public, right? And then whatever public is curious enough to listen to this 2 hour interview as well. Um, so just getting back to that point about Nord Stream 2, Tucker says, why don't you want to score a like political or propaganda victory? I don't know if he used the word propaganda. I can't recall, but um,
Yes.
he did. Okay. And like just say who gave you the information, right? And then Putin says the all of the American media is very difficult to defeat, and the American media is owned by bankers.
Oy vey.
Oy vey, indeed. So, I mean, our crowd will appreciate that. Him saying that they'll understand what he's getting at, right? The kind of signaling that's happening there. But it doesn't take away from the main point that no matter what kind of interview he conducted, right? No matter how much he had to sort of pander to an American demographic, right? Like it wasn't going to come, nothing's going to come of it. Like if anybody understands power elite theory, then they understand that, elites fall when they're disorganized or they just don't have the will to stay in control anymore. And that's true throughout the entire West. The war has revealed just what kind of lackeys the Europeans are to the Americans, and even how they play up their, because Putin also brought up Minsk 1 and 2, and how he was tricked by Merkel and Hollande, and uh, but particularly Merkel. Uh, because they played at this idea that they're kind of independent, right? And it kind of showed his naivete and everything. So I don't think I don't think it's necessarily addressing like the American people. Um, and even if it was, it can be contained. Now, there have been 180 million views worldwide, so that's a lot of people. How many of them are in the States? I don't know. But I would guess like a pretty big chunk. Um, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they thought this was a great interview and they liked it. I don't know. I mean, anybody who follows our show really closely, and you guys are definitely aware of the kind of subjects that Putin has brought up. For us, it was a lot of stuff that we already knew, we've already covered before, like. Um, so, anyways, I don't know. Like, some people are saying that it was a missed opportunity, but missed what? Like, what? He's going to give like such a great interview that, like, I don't know, the public is going to rise up and I don't know, demand more money go to European farmers than support Ukraine. Well, that's not
I
going to
mean,
happen.
but look at what we saw happen when he gave the in-depth interview of the history, where people just said that's Russian propaganda. Ukraine is
Yeah,
great.
yes.
Ukraine was the Kievan Rus. The Russians are all Mongols who just came in and stole Ukrainian identity and turned themselves into the Rus. Once again, you had like boomer liberals parroting Ukrainian
Yeah, yeah.
nationalist talking points. Like, I mean, now minus some of the criticisms of the Jewish stuff, saying that the Russians are controlled by Jews, whatever. But once again, it's gotten to the point where resist liberals, people who cried when Hillary Clinton didn't win, are adopting the rhetoric of Bandera and his followers. Like that was the response, not the entire, but that was in a significant part a response to this interview, and you see this happen time and time again. What should Putin have talked about? oh, the left has gone insane, woke has gone too far. I mean, he's done stuff like that before. He has thrown that red meat to Western audiences, but that's not what this interview was about. And I don't know if Tucker even expected it to be about that. I think Tucker, once again, if he expected anything, he thought this was going to be a replay of the Orban interview. I think that's the best example.
Hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I don't know really quite what to say. I think the controversy around the interview is more interesting maybe than the interview for me, but that, this is a very small demographic I'm talking about. So, you know.
I would say there's actually one moment where Putin looked stumped, and that was actually when Tucker had brought up the status of, now he didn't name my name, but the status of Transcarpathia and the treatment of Hungarians, and saying, well, do you think the Hungarians have the right to move troops in there? Now, I think Putin played it off well, but you could tell there was actually a moment where he had to think about how he was going to respond to the question of Hungary's relations with Ukraine. And personally, I'm not him. I'm not in his position. I think he could have given a better response to that. But I think that was the one
Mm.
like corner of the entire interview that Tucker was able to get him into. Well, do the Hungarians have right to take action against Ukraine? Now he more
Yeah,
or less
yeah.
wrote it
That's
off
what I
that
meant
like,
about he's also talking to an Eastern European
yeah,
audience, right? Yeah, I'm glad. No, no, continue. I'm
yeah,
glad you're extrapolating
yeah.
on that.
I mean, Putin more or less wrote it off as it's none of our business what the Hungarians do, which I think was probably the wisest answer he could have given. But
Yeah.
it's still, I figured he would have been prepared for something like that. And like I said, he was prepared for pretty much everything else, but that was the one thing they got him with. And I know people complain about the Nazi stuff, which it gets down to the difference between Western and Russian historiography. We've gotten into this before, and like I said, especially with that, and when he talked about the Nazification after Tucker asks, you could tell this was targeted towards the Russian Eastern European sphere, and maybe some Western elites. I said, for example, because I mean, Elon Musk, he has his ups and downs. Take what you will from him, but he talked about it a little on Twitter, and in fact, he made a comment. And it's like, well, most of the Bolsheviks weren't Russian, and I'd say I'm really proud of Elon for waking up on the Latvian question, but I do think in to some degree, now not primarily, but to some degree, the intention of this interview was to talk to some of, let's just say, uh, the periphery of the American elite, people who maybe are more willing to look at the alternative arguments. Not like that. I think that Elon Musk is really out there, really a trailblazer, really a contrarian, but he's somebody who's shown willingness to entertain alternative ideas. And you could say, well, not as polished. Trump also does fit that description. I'm sure maybe like a Peter Thiel, despite whatever you might think of him, I certainly don't have a positive opinion, is also somebody like that. But people like that who are on the fringes of the American elite aren't quite ostracized from it, but certainly aren't in the inner circle, so to speak. And I do think that at least as a secondary effect, that the interview was targeted towards people like them.
Yeah, there was also during the interview he brought up a because there is a Jewish American journalist that is in prison in Russia, has been for almost a year. Um, and Putin, as a counter, brought up a guy, Russian or Russian descent, I don't know, but he brought up. I just want to see if, yeah, yeah. There's a Russian who's currently in prison in Germany for assassinating a Chechen separatist. Uh, now that was, I had no idea about this. This can't be random, right? And I think that like that's a kind of signaling for maybe some kind of prisoner swap. You want your journalists back, then I don't know. But I like that is such an intricate detail. I'm not sure most Russians even know that. So I
Yeah, I
found
mean,
I
I
found
didn't know
that
it.
really weird, and very interesting.
Yeah, that and like I said, this interview had some insights, but to somebody who has been following this stuff for a number of years, and as I've mentioned before, the 17th century conflicts in Eastern Europe are one of the stranger historical fascinations I have, despite having very little to no connection to that part of the world, ancestrally or culturally speaking. But I've, like I said, I've always found that time period and place interesting with the 17th century in Eastern. So I knew a lot of this going in, but like I said, for somebody who probably doesn't even know what the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was, this was interesting, and I do like, conversely, how hard he was on the Poles. That was very entertaining. Especially to Tucker's audience, who have been trained now. I know that Law and Justice has fallen out of power, but Tucker's audience have been trained to see Poland as this last bastion in Europe of traditional values. Just the fact that he goes hard on them. They were responsible for World War II. They oppressed us in the 17th century. They're pains in the ass today. So that was, I had to admit, quite entertaining, but also at the same time, the appeals to the Poles when he talks about Bandera and the Ukrainian collaborators saying, well, look at how they treated the Poles. They did the same thing to Russians, Jews, etc. But yeah, that was, like I said, it's certainly worth the watch if you haven't already. Just don't go in expecting an actual interview. Just think of it as a Putin speech. He's rehashing a lot of what he said on February 22nd, 2022, with the recognition of
Yeah,
the Donbass republics. But like I said, probably the most interesting thing, probably the biggest takeaway, especially when it comes to relevance for today, is when he gets into the details about his conversations with Bush, Clinton, and the West in general in the 2000s.
yeah. I mean, I think I think this interview was sort of conducted the way the, the Russians are conducting the war. Um, they're not obsessed with propaganda victories. They care more for like points on the ground. And Putin is extremely patient. And I think he firmly believes he's going to win this conflict, and that all the propaganda or how the interview could be misconstrued or edited or whatever, and how many people are really going to listen to the full interview and so on, is not really his concern. As he said, the media is owned by bankers and they're very difficult to defeat. Uh, I think, for him, um, he wants to do something for posterity's sake, and that means victory. And you know, uh, definitely in the shorter or medium term. So
I do also think it's interesting that you have to keep in mind, while Tucker Carlson does have his own website, since his dismissal from Fox News and his independent program, his primary platform has been Twitter.
yeah,
And because he's a public figure, whatever, he has permission to post the 2 hour long videos on Twitter that we all wish we had, but we don't, unfortunately. But in many ways, that is, like I said, you can say what you will about Musk, but there has been something of a frontier opened with Twitter in his leadership when, like I said, while the alternative ideas aren't maybe embraced to our liking, they are allowed to be entertained at the very least. So that's something else that's worth noting about the interview.
mhm.
Um, like I
And
said,
speaking of Musk,
yeah, go ahead.
the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is now supplying the Russian military with Starlink satellites. Did you see? I saw Twitter just explode with this. They're in a furor about it. Yes. So I think that's interesting.
Oh no, that's great. That's perfect. That's I can't believe Elon Musk is in the pocket of Putin. It even through the UAE, it's his tentacles reach so far. And apparently, I also learned, despite a complete collapse in state infrastructure in Russia, that the KGB is still alive and well. That they didn't have to actually import state infrastructure from Russia and Belarus upon the fall of the Soviet Union. That giving up a third of their territory was just a ploy in order to convince us that
Yeah,
communism
yeah,
was over.
yeah,
That all, all of that. But
yeah.
I suppose with that being said, unless you have any further thoughts on that, we can get into some of the stuff about Biden and maybe touch on the Middle East a little.
Yeah, we can do that.
So, around the time the interview aired, Biden gave his own press conference. And this was to address the current nonsense going on into the investigation of his son and Biden's meeting with the special counsel. All of this. So, Biden returns from the realm of the dead after his meetings with Mitterrand and whoever the German chancellor was, the dead German chancellor that he said he
Yeah,
spoke to.
yeah,
Can't
yeah.
remember his name off the top of my head, but point being is
Helmut Kohl.
Cole. He keeps talking. He
He's
keeps
talking about NATO formation, and I'm going like, dude, that was like then. Oh my God, he thinks he's talking to Helmut Kohl. I remember when that dawned on me. It's like, oh wow, it's amazing.
yes, but Biden was kind enough to return from the realm of the dead in order to address us plebeians about the
Yeah.
accusations against him, and he gave a short press conference talking about how his memory is great. That what the special counsel said about him being a feeble old man with poor memory is just false, and he just spent 15 minutes berating the journalists and mumbling incoherently before returning back to the realm of the dead. And there's not really much you can say about the substance of this interview beyond the fact that this is the worst I've seen him in terms of mental faculties. And not that he's ever been particularly good since he's assumed office, but this was incoherent because they'll pump him full of the good drugs, they'll pump him full of whatever medication they need to in order to get him presentable for the public, even just for a half hour, even just for an hour. But it seems like that was completely thrown out the window. And like I said, this was the worst I have ever seen Biden in really any context. And
Hmm.
I don't know what the takeaway from this is supposed to be for the wider nation. And are we supposed to look at this and think
I
he's
mean, he's
going to run for
demonstrably
election?
senile.
Are we going to think this is a man who can debate? Are they going to have debates in 2024? Is he
Mm.
going to? Are they going to try to pull some nonsense where I am too morally principled to give Donald Trump a platform, so I'm not going to debate. Just ignore my complete
Yeah,
senility.
yeah, yeah.
Are they going to
So,
pull the 25th Amendment? Are they going to put Kamala in power? Are they going to pull some shenanigans of the DNC where they put? I know the big speculation is Michelle Obama or more likely Gavin Newsom as the nominee. Is Biden going to actually end up running again? And I do think that from this interview, these are questions, not interview, from this press conference, if you can even call it that, these are questions that do need to be asked. And when it comes to the special counsel, when it comes to the investigation into Hunter Biden, because as we all know, the axis of history pivots on Hunter Biden's laptop.
unbelievable. You know, it's
They're boomers are obsessed with this stuff. It's amazing. But yeah, as you were saying,
right. So basically, the bottom line is he's too senile to be charged with withholding documents after his tenure as vice president, but not senile enough to run a nation. Right. Like, I mean, that's the basic bottom line. I mean, of course, I think this whole thing was a hit because you remember, did it begin in late 2021 and it
yes,
went through 2022? Remember, they kept finding there were no less than three times that they found these documents that should have been at the White House and not in his garage or in the trunk of one of his classic Corvettes, right? Like, I was convinced they were thinking like we've got to get rid of him because some people were getting cold feet, maybe about the primaries, but also that the election campaign season was basically a year and a half away, and there were a lot of people angry about the 2020 election. There were a lot of people who even on the Democrat side were saying he is too old to run. You cannot picture this guy another 4 years. So I think, in a way, this whole investigation The real news story is saying he's just too senile, and you're supposed to read the implicit message, which is he should not be running. That's what I take away from this,
Fair
right?
point, fair point. And like, I don't know. Do you think they're gonna try to pull something at the DNC? I mean, it is in Chicago after all. If they want a good riot,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you brought up very good points as well. I don't know which faction is in the lead, but I do know which faction gained ground, and that's the one that initially just knew where the reports were, that they were in his garage. And yeah, you can talk all you want about he didn't obstruct anything and didn't withhold them. Okay, I get it, right? Uh, um, but the fact of the matter is they shouldn't have been there. And I suppose the bigger statement that you could make is they didn't have to do that. They just didn't have to. It didn't. It never had to make it to the media. So I think concerns over Biden have been persistent ever since he was elected president.
yes, I
And maybe
would
even
agree
more
with.
so after the Afghanistan debacle, right? But there's just too many gaffes, and they know 4 years later, like you mentioned, he's not going to be able to articulate himself very well during the debates. Now, I think he overperformed in the debates against Trump, and that has led me to think like, okay, obviously he's getting some kind of shots to keep him cognitive, right? Who's to know that they didn't give him as much as they needed before the presser?
And you do also have to wonder when it comes to these medications. I'm no doctor, I don't know anything about this, but what are the side effects of this? Are they weighing that, oh, if we give him too much of this is going to send him into a heart attack? I don't, like I said, I
Right.
don't know anything about these drugs, so, but it's very well within the realm of possibility that the cure is worse than the poison. So they need to
Yeah.
let him be a bit demented in order to, keep him alive, even. And you do have to wonder after, and if any of you have any more in-depth medical knowledge, I'd like to hear about this. You do have to wonder if, after a certain point of mental deterioration, if these drugs just become less effective. If you just really can't overcome the process of degradation, of the process of cognitive decline. And the question is that combined with the daily stresses of the office of the president and a myriad of other factors. I don't know what other health conditions he might have. Is he just speaking purely objectively, physically and mentally fit in order to continue on his duties? And sure, they could do the Sharonenko thing where they bring him out once a year and prop him up, but once again, we're not the Soviet Union. We have far more of a clownish media who would capitalize on it. Even his former supporters would jump on that. I mean, you do that in the Soviet Union, just nobody will talk about it. It's just the way it was. So there's a fundamental disconnect there. And like I said, does anyone want Kamala in power? Do the Republicans want Kamala Harris in power? I don't. I would rather deal with senile Biden. Do they have a suitable successor? Like I said, I think most realistically speaking, it would probably have to be somebody like Gavin Newsom, unless they, I don't know, they have some other uh, joke candidate out there they can
People
throw.
have been suggesting that it'll be Michelle Obama or
Yeah.
Big Mike.
I mean, yeah, I've heard that one. I could see them being foolish enough to do that, but for some reason, I don't know, gut instinct says Gavin Newsom.
That's what I would think. That would be the most intelligent choice, right? Um, he's kind of like, I mean, Trudeau is more like in his mold because Newsom is older than him. But Newsom is
They're the same
even,
type of person.
yeah, same type of person. He's even less nauseating to listen to than Trudeau. Trudeau is unbearable. I cannot listen to him for, I don't know, more than a minute.
Yeah, and
Um,
I mean, if we're just talking pure electoral politics, assuming everything is above board, which of course it would be, there's never been electoral fraud in American history. Newsom is the kind of guy that you can send to the suburbs. He's the kind of guy who relates that. When I mean, look, he governed California for a number of years. Like these are the kind of people that he had to win. Now I know California is far more left wing than most states, but in terms of moderation, in terms of whatever media image they paint for him, he is somebody who can win over the vaunted suburbs. And I do think that in
Hmm.
terms of a legitimate election, Newsom would actually be very dangerous to Donald Trump.
I agree.
And I think that is the most logical play. I don't know. Maybe they'll have a big Mike Newsom ticket, and who would be on which side, I actually don't know. But I do think that beyond the ego of the Obama family, it because once again, Michelle Obama, she has her cultists, the same people who fawned over Barack, but in terms of broad appeal, it's just not there. But like I said,
Hmm.
it, funny enough, they have to find the, at least by current standards, moderate white guy in order to win an election again. That's the image they tried to paint for Biden. And I know Newsom hasn't announced anything because, of course, the Democrats have the incumbent in power. But like I said, the DNC is going to be this summer. It's either July or August. I can't remember which one. And like I said, it's in Chicago, so who knows? History might repeat itself. But
I
something
think if they
has to be
announce,
done.
go ahead, go ahead.
And maybe the alternative solution that we're overlooking here is that Kamala is replaced as vice president by Newsom. Kamala is replaced as the running mate, because that could be the compromise. We still have our
Hmm.
guy in power, and we accept that Biden is either going to uh, croak or be unable to serve his full term. So look, it's moderate white guy in power again, and it's look. I wouldn't. I would take Newsom over 90% of Democrats. I'll put it that way. Not that I would like him, but in terms of what we're dealing with. Now, perhaps I shouldn't, because he would be more of a competent political threat. But point being is, despite whatever DEI nonsense is shoved down Americans' throats every day, most of them want a presentable white guy in the White House. That's just what it is at the end of the day. Instinctually, and that's across racial lines, except beyond the probably the most ideologically committed, beyond gender lines, everyone wants the moderate white guy in power, and you have Newsom right there on a silver platter.
Hmm. Um, I mean, there's several things that are happening now at the same time, right? Um, you have Biden's speech debacle. Remember, at one point he got so angry he left the podium to scold the journalist who had asked him if uh, if his memory, was fit enough to be president, essentially. He got very angry about that. How dare you question whether I remember? Like, but that was from the report. The report said that, not the reporters who were present. So you've got that going on. You've got the Tucker Carlson interview happening. And remember, like, you could look at it, right, that, okay, Tucker Carlson is going to Russia to interview Putin, right? It was sabotaged before, right? It could have been sabotaged again, but that didn't happen. So some people have speculated um, that let's say some people in the deep state wanted Tucker to go to create some kind of an off ramp, right? And then today you have announcements that within 90 days there will either be a total or partial withdrawal of American troops within Iraq and Syria. And I've seen, like, we don't know yet, but this story keeps popping up. And the first time it was said that they were just rumors, but then it was true. And then you had basically neocons and neolibs saying, no, you can't do that. And that was put on the back burner at the end of December and early January, right? So what if there's something else here at play, right? And they cannot have something at play would mean something bigger, even bigger is coming along. And neither Biden nor Trump can be the guy in charge or look to be the guy in charge. Obviously, we know that America can function, like if it was a golden retriever, it would still function to some degree, right? But for the sake of optics, they need somebody there.
That's
And
what it gets down to. When people call the president a figurehead, it's not that the figure is completely powerless, but it's that his primary job is to be the salesman of the ideas that's being
right,
pushed by the, for lack of a better term, deep state.
right. So this is sort of like, I don't know, kind of like an eschatological moment for democracy, right? Where you could have
It
anybody.
dies in darkness.
Yes, I know. So You could have like a golden retriever do the job, but then people will wonder, like, well, how is that possible, right? So, um, so they do need to have a face, and I think they understand that because of course, if it just prolongs this way, then they know that the president is irrelevant, right? And they're not willing to get to cross that threshold because that's what inevitably they would have to do if Biden remained in power. So, like, obviously, there's something happening geopolitically, as I mentioned, in the Middle East. Tucker, even being able to conduct this interview in the first place, uh, Musk goes along with it. Now, Musk, okay. I mean, he's done some things that are better on Twitter, but he still had to grovel and go to the Auschwitz and go to the Auschwitz Museum, and he's had to go to Israel. He's had to like pledge all these allegiances to the actual American elites and so on and so on. And but if they wanted to, they could stop this interview, couldn't they? I mean, I think they could. Um, Twitter is kind of in some financial doo-doo, and Musk needs some of their backing. That's been in the news for months now, for a year. Um, so I don't know. Like I say, I think there's something at play here, and I guess the bottom line is the elites do not want Biden or Trump in office.
No, absolutely not. And they're going to, and you actually see this on the Republican side right now, where they are trying like hell to make Nikki Haley relevant, and it's failing at every turn. You had the Nevada elections, the Nevada caucus, in which case none of the above won. The option, none of the above won. There was no declared winner because Trump was taken off the ballot in Nevada. You had Haley, you had whatever, who's ever left of these still running. I think, despite the fact that DeSantis is suspended, he's still on the ballot in some of these states. But this is what we're looking at here. You see the legal charges against Trump persist, and they're, even if they're not going to throw him in prison, they are going to put this. They're going to put him in an unwinnable position where he has to fight an uphill legal battle, all while campaigning for president. And who knows? Maybe he'll even have some arrest warrants in some states that he can't visit. Now, I don't think it's going to go that far, at least yet, but it is within the realm of possibility. And they are, as you had said, in a completely dire position because they can't tolerate either side winning. Both are disasters for the sake of the regime. Now, Biden is probably the more manageable disaster because of just his age, of his optics, and the fact that he's much more easily replaceable. But Trump, who they spent years, since 2015, telling us is the devil incarnate, they let him back in power. It's going to completely undermine their own claims. And the fact that Trump, despite the fact his policy probably won't be much different, rhetorically he's going to be much more harsh. Rhetorically, Trump's going to be much more radical, which is something they can simply not afford, especially at this point.
Mhm.
And I would say if either Trump or Biden are going to come into power, they have to put a neat bow on one of the two major conflicts going on right now because you can't have both an Eastern European and Middle Eastern war going on in such a legitimacy crisis. Sure, you can weather one. You can tolerate Russia Ukraine. You can tolerate Israel Palestine. You can't do both. And you even saw this when Biden called Sisi, the president of Mexico, talking about opening up the so-called humanitarian corridor on the Sinai Peninsula, also known as the Yucatan Peninsula. But you can tell, even despite his complete dropping of the ball rhetorically, even despite his complete stroke out moment, they are trying to put a rapid end on this Middle Eastern conflict so they can tell Netanyahu to shut up, accept the status quo. We need to figure out the situation in Ukraine, which is quite the opposite direction it seemed to be going in the first few months there, because it was, sorry Ukraine, we got to focus on Israel now. Now, given the distraction of Israel, given the arms diversions, that has cost Ukraine dearly. And with somebody like Syrskyi now in charge of the Ukrainian armed forces, the war effort's probably only going to get worse for them, considering the fact that I forgot to mention this before. Syrskyi wants to completely drop any moral qualms about conscription. If you're eligible to be conscripted, you're going to. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you are physically capable of holding a rifle, if you meet our criteria for conscription, we're done giving exemptions. We're done with all of that. Now, whether that will actually happen or not, who knows? But that is Syrskyi's stated position on conscription, that he wants another 500,000 men at arms in order to continue on with the war effort. And
Right.
yeah,
Now, it should be mentioned that their bill that they wanted to pass in early January did not pass. They're afraid of like a political fallout, and that's probably also the reason why they got rid of Zaluzhnyi.
yeah, and that was
Even
the
though Zaluzhnyi said essentially the same thing, I need 450,000 men, roughly the same figure,
yeah,
about a half a million
and
men.
now that you bring it up, speaking of bills, even though that one failed to get past the Rado because they have some sense of self-preservation, you had the debacle in Congress trying to pass this multifaceted bill that was going to fund Israel, Ukraine, and the border. Turns out the bill falls through, but the Republicans still vote to fund Israel and Ukraine, which shouldn't
Mm,
shock
mm, mm.
anyone.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
border crisis
yeah.
is still unresolved. Texas and the federal government are still
Of
at
these
odds
three
with each
things,
other.
only one can be sacrificed.
And oh, guess what? Oh, what a tragedy! If Israel and Ukraine wouldn't get their aid. And I suppose Janet Yellen was right. We do have enough money to fund two wars, just not three involving the one on our own border.
Yeah, it's pathetic.
Yeah, maybe we should lean into the Egypt-Mexico thing so Biden will actually send support to the border. Who knows? Maybe that's the winning tactic here. And I remember, just to get not to get too much into Capitol Hill politics, the absolute lambasting of the Republicans because they didn't want to support the border bill that would effectively legalize everyone who crossed over the border. I think it allowed for up to, what was it, 5,000 a month, was it, or something ridiculous like that. In terms of the number of border crossings they would allow, the pathway to citizenship caveats, which still exist today, and the funding for the border, which once again, it was effectively an open borders bill. So the Republicans, to their credit, did shoot that down, but they still did approve the tens of billions of dollars in aid to both Ukraine and Israel. But getting back to that point, like I said, you're starting to see the two sides of this, which I don't think shocks anyone. That Biden wants to shelve the stuff in the Middle East. He wants to forget about the Iran stuff. Notice that we're withdrawing troops from Iraq and Syria right now, and he hasn't touched the Iranian issue, and focus has been put on Ukraine. I can imagine once the campaign season really starts, once it's more or less confirmed that Trump is the nominee, because we all know he's going to bloviate about supporting Ukraine. In fact, he said that, oh, we need to make sure the Ukrainians get the aid they get. But what he'll do is he'll do what we had talked about before: pass the buck to the Europeans. And even if that aid comes from America ultimately, at least it has the image of, this is German, this is French, this is British aid going to Ukraine, so it's not our
Yeah,
problem anymore. And he
right.
will double down in the Middle East. He'll double down on the Iranian issue. Talk about how vindicated he was in being so tough on Iran, and that this is the toughest administration ever on the Iranians. That we need to be back so we can force them to capitulate. Blah 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 blah. And look,
Hmm. Actually, that's one of the
yeah,
reasons. Another reason why they've had trouble with conscription, right? And remember, the Ukrainian forces, many of them or most of them, have never been on rotation, right? So they're exhausted. And but just to get back to my point, um, they literally need the money for conscription. They literally need the money to pay the the soldiers. Britain gave them an injection of 2.5 billion a few weeks ago, and of course the European Union settled when Orban buckled, and 53 billion. But it's 53 billion over um, 4 years. Roughly, Ukraine needs not a. This is based on 2022, early 2023 statistics. I don't know what the inflation rate there is now. I imagine it's worse, if not stabilized. And so Ukraine needs about 5 billion a month, right? So 53 billion over 4 years is not that much. It's enough, just barely enough to keep the minimum 5 billion per month going. Um, you know, and a tiny bit of extras. Um, but that's just for mostly for civil infrastructure and jobs and whatnot, right? Um,
Yeah, that's in order to just keep the gears of the state running so they don't have complete institutional collapse.
yes.
And I mean, I don't to pivot back to Ukraine. I don't know what the play is here. Now, I know that they got the European Union to capitulate, that Orban even was strong-armed into accepting the aid. The what actually did happen in terms of European news was when it came to the vote to admit Sweden to NATO, Fidesz just didn't show up to the vote, uh, uh, which failed to legitimize the Hungarian parliament's vote because they had too many absentees. So that was funny. And
Mhm. I mean, I think he thought basically what would happen to Hungary is what the EU did to Greece in 2010.
oh
It,
yeah,
they just closed down the banks. I
and
don't know.
I mean that still has to be in the realm of possibility now. And because you brought it up, I suppose I will pivot to European Union politics and just the dire state of Europe because we actually have a little more time than I was expected when it came to covering the interview. We actually got through that a little bit faster than I expected, so we could probably do not another half hour before I have to shut down shop here.
Mhm.
Maybe 45 minutes, but point being is you had mentioned what happened with Greece with the Eurozone crisis in 2010 through roughly 2014, 2015, when you had the Brexit vote where they were going to stay on the euro or not. Now, ultimately, they did, but that was when the European Union had far more legitimacy. You could go in and you could wreak havoc on the economy of a smaller member state and have no consequences met. But a series of actions did follow from that. So around 2014, 2015, and now even going back to 2010, you had the economic crisis in Greece. You have the talks to admit Ukraine into NATO in 2013, which Yanukovych stalled, in which case that led to the Maidan, him being overthrown because he stalled those talks out. That's
Yeah.
2013, 2014. We go into 2015, 2016. There's talks of Brexit, and that's coupled with the migrant crisis coming from the Middle East, coming from Syria. And mind you, Turkey is a key player in all of that. Turkey is also, to this day, still considered a candidate for membership of the European Union. I mean, it's never going to happen, we all know that. But back when the possibility was much more serious for getting Turkey into the EU, that was still something that was considered. And you had the migrant crisis as an outgrowth of that. So you had just in the course of 5, 6 years, about a crisis a year, sometimes even more. 2016, Brexit actually happens. 2017, Trump is in power. Relations between the European Union and the United States, while not bad, become much more strained. Trump is hammering on the issue of NATO and defense funds and so on and so forth. You get into 2018, 2019, you see the brief populist wave. You have the first populist coalition that comes to power in Italy. You have Front National coming in second place in the elections. You have the AFD's rise in Germany. You have, now they were in power before, but you have Law and Justice coming to prominence in Poland. Not that would really consider them populist, but once again, they were on far harsher terms with the European Union than, say, the previous Tusk administration before this current one. You had the issue of Hungary, which had been a renegade. And you see these small, latent movements across the continent that just continue to chip away at the legitimacy, slowly but surely, of the European Union. All this while the migrant crisis is still continuing. Then you have the construction and completion of the Nord Stream pipeline, which drives another wedge into Europe, where some countries want to cooperate with Russia on energy and trade issues. But then you have Poland, the Baltic states, and that wing of the European Union who want more hostility towards Russia, driving. You're starting to see all these little holes you can poke in so-called European unity throughout all of this. And trust me, I'm getting to an ultimate point here. So probably the most pivotal event in the European Union's history breaks out with the Ukraine war in 2022. Russia's completely cut off, 11 sanction packages, etc. Then you have one sole rogue state within the European Union who throws its hands up at the sanctions, continues importing Russian oil, continues proper diplomatic relations with the Russians, and that's Hungary. Hungary continues to do this. They continue to try to gain allies in other small countries such as Slovakia, even some discontent in places like Romania, Bulgaria. He plays on that. You have the Hungarian deals with Serbia, which is outside the European Union, and while maybe not factually true, is generally viewed by Brussels as a satellite of Russia. Now, it's certainly far from a satellite, but as far as Brussels is concerned, Serbia might as well be Russia 2.0. And you have Orban completely flying in the face of the European Union, getting media coverage for it, getting praise from the right wing across the world for it, and they find themselves in this current position where the European Union is in its very own legitimacy crisis, and it only gets worse every year. You have this country that has completely given you the middle finger, does not cooperate with any of your edicts, which, look, don't get me wrong, I'm fully in support of Hungary when it comes to all of that. And you get to this point where Europe, having been economically strangled out, particularly by American proposed sanctions, has to do something about this country that shows that, hey, maybe there's another way. Now, I don't think Orban's going to succeed. Ultimately, I do have a very bleak outlook for the future of Hungary. Not that I want it to happen, but I have to say my pessimism does prevail when it comes to my analysis of the situation in Hungary, particularly because of this. So you have Europe, which is already mired in economic troubles, with the ability to more or less shut down the banks of whatever country it wants to, as we saw in Greece in 2010, particularly if they're in the Eurozone. Croatia, at the beginning of, I believe it was last year, 2023, adopted the Euro. And even if they don't have the Euro, Hungary doesn't have the Euro, there still are moves they can pull. I mean, for example, you still have Hungarian assets frozen before this Financial Times article came out. There are so many avenues they can pull to completely collapse a government, collapse a local economy within the European Union. Sure, it might have reverberating effects. Sure, it might be a hit to their legitimacy. But point being is, Brussels has the capability to do all of this. And in the next few years, if there is more discontent in Europe, if more Europeans do come to their senses and realize this is pointless, we're destroying ourselves, you can be guaranteed that Brussels will do this. Now, I know that the Hungarians are supposed to have EU presidency next year, but much like the presidency in the United States, much like every political establishment, just because somebody from Fidesz is the top guy in the European Union doesn't mean any of his policies will be implemented by the underlings. In fact, they will probably be actively stifled by the underlings because that is the way it's going to work out. And honestly, I do think that Hungary opens itself up for a lot of attack when they do have control of the European Union presidency because that is going to bring so much more scrutiny, so much more ire on them. Where even if their guy is in power, even if their guy is EU commissioner or whatever, that is going to still draw the ire of the Eurocrats where the real power lies, draw the ire of member states. And look, I don't know if there's an impeachment or removal process when it comes to the Brussels government, when it comes to the structure and power there, but I can guarantee you whatever he tries to get done will be stifled by that, and that blowback will be brought back to Hungary. And some may call me a pessimist for this. Look, don't get me wrong. I would love for Fidesz to run the entire European Union superstructure and turn it into a right wing organization and fix all the problems there, but it's not going to happen. It is simply not going to happen. And truthfully, they're probably not even going to be able to get minor changes done, and Europe will continue down the same slow and sad trajectory, barring radical and sudden political change. Now, I'm not saying that's out of the realm of possibility, but I have yet to see any evidence of it happening anytime soon.
Oh, I think that was a great summary. Um, Yeah, I mean, it honest. I think 2024 is going to be really, really pivotal. It's going to be such a decisive year. I don't know what more I can add to that.
And I suppose we have to keep our eye on Ukraine because although I was wrong about my prediction about Poland getting involved in the war, at least in an official capacity, Poland does continue to increase the size of its military while every other European military is seemingly shrinking.
Hmm.
And they are probably at this point, if Russian successes do continue on the slow and steady pace that they do, the only stopgap they have. Now, whether that be a harassment of Kaliningrad, whether that be just involvement in Ukraine, but I had to imagine, and perhaps I'm wrong, the only way to keep Ukraine a winnable battle is Poland. And who knows, maybe just not that I think this, but if we're just going to do very outlandish speculations, maybe the interview that Putin did will backfire when it comes to audiences in places like Poland and the Baltic states, and that will
Hmm.
increase
Hmm.
ire
Hmm.
against Russia. Because once again, he was not very conciliatory towards them. Not that I think he should have been. Not that I can really blame him given the context of the situation. But and I don't speak Polish. I don't have much ear to the ground with the Polish media. But I can imagine, especially considering the fact that when it comes to historiography, they are very much uh, in line with the Russians. I think a lot of the Slavic people are like that when it does come back to just spouting all those historical facts.
Yeah, yeah,
They can very easily spin this as saying, well, look at what the Russians think of us. Look at the amount of anti-Polish sentiment that they're drumming up. So if they're wise, if the people looking to continue and escalate the Ukrainian war are really looking for something to do that, stoking tensions in Poland has to be their number one priority. And like I said, despite the fact that I enjoyed the interview, despite the fact that I think some good will come of it, there's the potential that it is used exactly for that. And who knows? Maybe that was Tucker's intention. Maybe that Tucker is completely compromised. And they wanted to send him over there to get some Russian historic diatribe that they can use to drum up
yeah.
tension in Eastern Europe.
I mean, to be fair, Tucker did say, this is fascinating. I just don't know how useful this is. I thought that was an important moment. It was very early on in the interview, definitely within the first 15 minutes,
Yeah, yeah.
10 minutes, somewhere around there.
But like I said, even though Putin did temper his rhetoric, if you do listen to the substance of what he was saying, it was very anti-Polish. And mind you, that this is after not only did Putin try to reconcile with the West and was stumped for that, he tried to reconcile with the other Eastern European countries. He
Yeah,
issued an official state apology for the Katyn massacres that happened in 1939.
yeah,
He went to Poland. He built a monument to all of Stalin's victims across nationalities, across the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc states. Once again, very much, and look, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, trying to put some distance between modern Russia and that
yeah.
the darker parts of the Soviet history. But like I said, that was not reciprocated. It was not met with that. You still have Poles complaining to this day that the evil Soviet Russians oppressed us. Blah 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 blah. And at that point, Putin, especially post 2014, post 2022, especially when it came to relations with some of these smaller Eastern European states, just threw up his hands and said, screw it. Maybe there's some hope of reconciliation with the West to really control you guys, if we're being honest. But
Hmm.
insofar as reaching out to our Polish friends and neighbors, insofar as reaching out to the Baltic states, Romania, whatever, he realized you people are a lost cause. You're not going to cooperate. You're still so filled with historic resentment that no ground is going to be broken here. And I do think that in many ways, and I think the most conspiratorial take you can have on the interview is Putin went over there, and Tucker went over there to speak to Putin, knowing that he would give Russian historiography for an hour and a half. In which case, he realized, hey, this is going to piss off the Poles. It's going to
Yeah,
stoke
yeah, yeah.
tensions in Europe. And like I said, not that I buy into that, but I do think that is a possibility worth considering.
Well, I mean, for countries in Europe that already like Putin, they'll like him more. For countries that already hated Putin, they'll hate him more. So there's nothing new that he introduced. There's just some expansion, essentially, on the topics that he said back in February 2022.
And I
There's new subject matter as well. Don't get me wrong.
yeah,
Obviously, several things happened in the space of 2 years, but much of the historical rhetoric is the same coming from him.
and I know that people were making the jokes that hey, CNN, MSNBC can't clip this because it's just too long. But point being is, I do think that when it comes to Eastern European media, this plays right into that Slavic autism where they
Yeah,
can
yeah,
it touches on ethnic historiography, which at least in my personal experience, out of all the people I've interacted with internet in the person, nobody's more obsessed with historiography and ethnography than Slavs. It
yeah,
just
yeah.
it just seems to
True.
be that way, and look, they're fascinating subjects. I don't get me wrong, but it hits a certain nerve with them for better or for worse, and I'm sure you can
Hmm.
speak to that far more than I can.
Well, I got into an argument
Oh, I love these
with a
stories.
Romanian guy this week. He comes into my workplace. I'm not going to tell you where I work and why he shows up
He
there,
works for
but
CSIS, and we all know it.
is so he. I mean, I get along with him most of the time, right? And it's fine and well, but he's a Romanian. He's going on and on about how the Serbs I know in Serbia, they're good, they're okay, but not the ones here. And of course, it's because some Serb that owns a truck parked in a parking spot in his apartment building that he said he's not legally allowed to park in. It's just so ridiculous.
What is this, a Seinfeld episode?
I know it's literally that, right? So that was the argument, and another one was oh, he brought up Yugoslavia or whatever, and I said the day after the Soviet Union fell, all funding from the West to Yugoslavia stopped, and only the provinces outside of Serbia got funding. Obviously, that was to encourage certain things. And he's like, no, no, no. I'm going, yes, 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 that happened. Like I go, don't pretend you know Yugoslavian history. Um, so I said, I mean, I go, how hard is this to understand, right? When you have very different people and they're cooperating. The reason they're cooperating is because there's money to be made in that society, right? But when the money dries up, people go to their own groups. And Yugoslavia is a prime example of it, right? I mean, it's just so dumb. And he goes, I'm a lawyer, when I moved to this country, they didn't acknowledge my degree. I go, do you know why? And he goes, why? I go, because they think less of your country. They think it's a shitty little country. It's not relevant. That's why, you do the job that you do, and you're not, even though you're a trained lawyer and you worked as a lawyer in Romania. I just uh, like they will be the first ones to complain about how bad the system is, how it could be improved. This is what they should do. Blah 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 blah. But as soon as it touches on Russia, they become like totally all those arguments are swept aside. They just become stupid neolibs, stupid neocons right away,
You know,
right?
I just realized something. Oh, sorry, the live studio audience is acting up.
Yeah.
But but
The live studio audience.
yeah, what can I say? I have a number of different fans, but that being said, I had to backtrack. It's going to be a bit of a weird aside, but I had to mention it. In many ways, do you know who Putin reminded me of that in that interview?
Who?
Emil Kosman.
No. Wait. Emil Kosman interviews Vladimir Putin.
Oh, if only. But I don't know, just something about the cadence and rhetoric just very much reminded me of that.
Can you imagine all the gestures that Kosman does, like the fist thing,
Oh, yeah, the sound effects.
Yeah,
But
yeah. He wouldn't like. He only does that, I think, because he's on his own. I think.
it's amazing, number one. But getting back to your point, because I don't know, you bring up Romanians, remind me of that.
Like my best friend is Romanian. Don't get me wrong, right? Like he's not like that. He's not like that at all. Like I'm not speaking for all Romanians, but like I'm just familiar with it. Family members,
Yeah,
friends, yes.
the petty nationalism that exists in that part of the world that is still can very much be drummed on, and I do think that it touches exactly on that. And in some cases it's less petty, in some cases it's more petty, but it really does just re. I don't want to say reopen the wounds because that makes it sound like a much bigger event than it was, but it really does bring up old topics of discussion when it comes to this, and it in a way it almost mainstreams them. Now I know we've talked about this stuff for a number of years just because of the nature of this
Yeah,
program, but when it comes to Tucker Carlson, this is not the content that he does. Sure, he does go off the beaten path to his credit to a degree. I have very mixed views on Tucker, but in terms of whatever Western audience watch this, it does in a way mainstream a lot of the baked-in ethnic conflicts that are still yet to be resolved in this part of the world. Because you look at just a contrast with Western Europe, and not that I'm saying that Western Europeans are vastly superior or even superior at all at this point, if they ever were. But the ingrained ethnic conflicts were beaten out of them, particularly by the Americans, and we see this post World War II. There, how much ethnic resentment exists between the French and the Germans, for example? Sure, old British guys in the pub might run their mouths about the French, but how many of them actually have a deep, sort of ingrained ethnic rivalry with them? It's just non-existent anymore. The the forces of history have been played out in Western Europe to some degree, and I do think we see that. But in a much more nascent civilization, which, if you want to consider a separate civilization, which I think to a degree is certainly justified, but the historical forces are much more nascent in Eastern Europe, I would say. So even though they are living in the modern world, even though they are living the so-called modern morality under the umbrella of the American Empire, these issues, these ideas, have not been fully worked through. And in many ways, that historical process has been stifled by the conditions of the modern world. And I know some people say, "Oh, it's good because it prevents war." Well, look at what's happening right now. Clearly, it doesn't. But many of these nations had their development stopped in the earliest stages in terms of national identity, in terms of civilizational identity, where they exist in the strange limbo where they are fully fledged nation states. They are quote unquote equal sovereign nations, and we all know that's a crock. But in terms of actually cultural, historical, and civilizational development, it has been stunted. And Russia's been pretty much the only exception from that because they found themselves somewhat outside the system. Perhaps Russia being rejected from NATO, being rejected from the EU was a blessing in disguise because it allowed them to continue on with their historical development as a people. Because sure, you could say Russia has its roots back in 862, as Putin reminded us, but compare that to much of the West, and when you even want to get into the baptism of the Rus, if you consider that the actual source of their history, which was 988, or if you even want to get into, because of the separation, Muscovy as the real origin of the Russian civilizational state, so to speak. That we're talking once again, we're getting to the 12th century, 13th century there, after they broke free from the Mongols and their very successor states. But point being is, the historical development in the West is much older. Now, older doesn't necessarily mean better or superior, just the fact that these processes took place before they did in the East. And in that case, I do think there is a lot more gas in the tank, so to speak, and with a lot of these Eastern European countries. But in many ways, as I had previously mentioned, that has been stunted by just the events, particularly the 20th century.
Hmm.
I don't know if you had anything to add to
I didn't.
that rant in particular, because like we've given that diatribe many times on the show, and
Yeah, yeah.
there's a reason why, because it's perpetually relevant. It's something that always comes up, and I mean, looking forward at this, just at the global situation in general, I do think that they need to find an off ramp in the Middle East sooner or later, because I think that with everything that has developed in Ukraine just in the past month, since the beginning of this year, they are still far more dedicated to that. And look, I know the Zionist lobby, all of that, APAC, they are very powerful forces indeed. But as we said, there's been a bit of a rift between the diaspora and the homeland when it comes to that. And look at how much less attention, well, how much the attention has decreased on the topic of Israel and Palestine just since October. It it's cratered. Now, sure, you
Yeah.
hear about it every once in a while. You hear about the operations in Gaza. You hear about whatever the Iranians talk about. But really, since the beginning of the year, at least, and that's not even getting to the end of last year, attention on the topic has completely fallen off, and that focus has pivoted back to Ukraine. Sure, we joked about Ukraine being the forgotten war, but when it comes to investment, when it comes to what is vital for the collective West, so to speak, to continue, they realized, yeah, like, okay, Israel, sure, we have to support it, but they're going to be a much more secondary priority, especially with how bad their optics have been to the current conflict in Ukraine, because that is where we've invested everything. That is where we've decided to make our stand in this rivalry against the Russians. And they have to see this through one way or another, and pretty much any capitulation, any any outcome in Ukraine that doesn't end in Russia's humiliation at this point for the West is simply unacceptable. Yet
Yes.
they have nothing to deliver that.
Right, right. And I mean, you're right. The bulk of the funding is going to sorry, to Ukraine rather than Israel. And I don't know, like the potential removal of American troops from Iraq and Syria is somehow like where would they be stationed? Now, I saw a report, remember way back in November or December, I said that America's one of its cruiser and its cruiser groups is leaving, but they're going to retain two landing boats. They're not landing boats like the way you would think in necessarily World War II. Okay, they open up in this smaller like light tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that come out that are amphibious. Okay, they can house about 2,000 each, so 4,000. Now, I saw another report that there's two of them now that are not in the Red Sea, but in the Eastern Mediterranean, which obviously means like Israel. Also, recall that there was a helicopter that was shot down. Well, the Americans say it was an accident, but I think five U.S. Um, either Marine or Army personnel in the helicopter died crashing into the ocean. I tend to think that they might have been shot. In any case, but it wasn't the right time for a red line or whatever. But and then you have Milei. Milei, of course, visited Israel. He's on his way of becoming a Jew. He went to the Wailing Wall. He was crying, crying, and he had to be held by another man next to him. And today he
Not
gave a
even a full
speech.
fledged convert, and he's already kvetching.
Yeah, and then he gave a speech about how the reconstruction of the Jewish temple has to happen, which of course means destroying the Al-Aqsa Mosque, obviously, right? Um,
Do you ever have your political pitch just going up and saying, "Hey, we need the Antichrist"?
so I don't I'm not sure exactly where this is going, right? Like we will have to wait because, of course, there's 90 days that are allotted for the removal, the total removal, or the partial removal of U.S. troops in Syria and Iraq. Now, you know, apparently there's only 1,000 or so in Syria, several times more in Iraq, right? But that doesn't include contractors, right? So the numbers are higher than that, but those are still minuscule amount of troops. Like I'm just curious what happens with that. And yet, you're hearing talk about, a NATO expeditionary force that would enter Ukraine, that would allow Ukrainian reserves that are guarding the Belarusian and the northern Ukrainian border with Russia to go and fight in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass and
Well,
Zaporozhye.
I mean, that's always another play that something happens in Belarus that they do try a regime change there. I mean, it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
not unheard of, and uh, perhaps that big Polish army isn't going towards Ukraine, but going towards Belarus instead. Who knows? There was already speculation of that.
yeah.
The Poles saying that, well, oh, if there is armed resistance in Belarus, we would be obligated to go in and support them. And who knows? Maybe that is still in the plan.
That's
Maybe that
so
still is in the
insane.
card.
Why? They're not Polish.
Oh, they just don't know it. They are Polish.
Mm.
Don't you know that there's a Polish minority in Belarus?
Yeah. Too bad, so sad.
But I mean, that is very realistically a move they can make. There are many, let's just say, many drastic moves they can make that would come at extreme
Yeah, just
consequences. The question is, if or when are they willing to do those?
I mean, look, they've got, if you believe the numbers of either Zelensky or Putin or Zaluzhnyi before he was fired, Ukraine has somewhere between 485,000 troops right now who are fighting, and it could be as high as 650, 670,000 troops. Um, Look how difficult it's become for them to arm them, right? And look at we saw in December articles about, gangs um, pressing men into the ranks by snatching them from the street. In fact, they were called body snatchers by the New York Times. And now you're seeing reports in late January and early February about the one thing that Ukraine needs is men. And even on Ukrainian television, when you have soldiers who are on a small rotation, who end up on talk shows, will say the number one thing we're lacking is men. Well, I mean, they're lacking men because what they're basically saying is for us to return to 1991 borders, I mean, even 500,000 will not be enough. To be perfectly honest.
No, it won't. And I don't know what they. Sure, maybe clear out Donbass and sacrifice Crimea, which seems like the counterintuitive move if, from Ukraine's perspective, that Crimea should be the priority. But once again, Russia's not budging on that. They're
No, and you got the sense from the Putin interview that he doesn't, because he grieved a lot for being tricked and for being naive. But you get the feeling that, despite his statements, I'm willing to negotiate, and normies will jump all over that. You still had the feeling that, he the time of trusting the West and America is essentially over. He's willing to go into dialogue with the U.S. because obviously everybody else is the middleman leading to the U.S. But I mean, dialogue and how he already said that he's not willing to give up anything that they've gained, and he's said it before in the past. So it's not just this interview that more extensive buffer zones might be needed. Of course, it means like if you want to prolong the war, you're going to lose more territory. But even that, even gaining territory has been extremely slow. I think they're waiting and hoping for a collapse, but the Ukrainians still can pick men off the street. Just the other day, or yesterday, there were two minivans, each filled with 20 guys that were trying to get out of Ukraine. They were caught. I mean, they essentially are dead men within 2-3 months.
oh, absolutely, and it does make you wonder. And I think the last thing I'll touch on is we've seen it throughout history. We've seen it every time they've tried to do conscription. If they push it too far, there eventually is a draft riot. Now, the question is whether that succeeds or not, and you can see many examples to both. But I mean, I figured it would have happened in Ukraine already. I figured they would. Is it
Yeah.
is it that is the state that overbearing where they can't even afford to have a draft riot, where they're afraid to even stick their heads out. And the question is, have we ever seen a conscription campaign so extensive where they are just throwing people in black vans and driving them off to be trained? Not that I can think of, and at least outside of, say, some African dictatorship that doesn't really have an army, just beyond show. But I can't think of any other examples like this, and especially when it comes to, say, the question of the draft riot. But
Yeah.
uh,
Well, there have been instances now where they've killed conscription officers.
I know there was the one conscript who threw the grenade in the town hall meeting, and
Yeah, there's another one where a man killed. Well, what happened was his son was taken from him, and then a week later, he gunned down one of these guys. I don't know if it was the same guy or the same one of the same men who took his son away, but there were photos that he shot him with an AK. So
I mean, yeah, that I'm surprised we don't see more stories like that, and perhaps as the situation does become more overbearing. And the question is, I know that you said that they caught the two minivans full of men trying to escape.
mhm.
As the situation deteriorates, as it becomes a poorer and less functional country, how easily will the border guards be bribed? How easily will they be willing to let people out?
Yeah,
And
that's where a lot of the money is going, right?
yeah, that's it. It does seem to be that way. And the question is, how many more surrenders to Russia will we see in the coming months? Because uh, look, I don't believe the Russian figures when they say 10,000 people have surrendered since we set up the radio channel to signal for surrender, the Volga channel. But I do believe that probably somewhere in the thousands have used that method to cross over the Russian lines. I mean, they have drone footage of this happening on several occasions,
Yeah, yeah.
and I can imagine the situation becomes more dire as if Sirski conducts himself in this war effort like he did in Bakhmut, then desertion and surrender will likely go up. Now, by how much, I don't know, but we could see a situation where he completely crushes morale within the Ukrainian forces, and that all remains to be seen. There's only so much speculation we can do, and that's really all I had for this episode. If you have any last minute things,
I do, in fact. Let's recall that Prigozhin, before he died, said that Zaluzhnyi will no longer be the head general and that it'll be Sirski. He made that prediction. And Zhirinovsky said there will be no elections in America.
true.
So who knows?
You know what? I have no reason to disbelieve it, but suppose that's as good a point as ever,
Keeping my
man. No.
fingers crossed.
Now, just a brief update. I will be out of town for the next 2 weeks, so we should be back actually on anniversary day on the 24th. If that works for you, I should be able to pull that off.
Oh, that'd be great.
And we can do a retrospective. But with all that being said, we will see you in what will likely be 2 weeks. I'll keep you guys posted, just depending on my availability. See you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.